thing linked up. I was going to show a cute little video on just a time lapse of sky scenes to set the stage for today, but we don't have time for that. So, we're going to... Pardon me?
Eric went on too long with his celebration.
Yes, I know, yeah. We lost it again, okay. Bishop Alpha Hall.
There it is.
Okay. We will see if it stays on through this whole thing here. But this morning we're starting our series, walking through the major stories of the Bible. And today we're doing Genesis chapter 1. And so as we look at Genesis chapter 1, the first thing that we need to realize is that anytime we come to a text, we have questions that we ask of it. And also every text that's written is answering and addressing certain questions. Now the problem with Genesis chapter 1 is all too often when we study it today, we're asking the wrong questions of the text. We ask questions about creation, scientific creation, Big Bang theory, evolution, various things like this. And for the ancient Israelite, 2,000 to 5,000 years ago, this would have been the last thing in their mind. These would have been questions they would have never fathomed, never asked. So when we look at this text, one of the things we have to start doing is saying, what are the issues that it's addressing, how is it addressing it, and what is it talking about here in this text? So as we look at Genesis chapter 1, what I want to do is look at how this text is structured and what it talks about. Now the first thing we need to realize is that the book of Genesis as a whole is structured by this Hebrew word tadoleth, which means oftentimes it's written as generations or accounts of or history of or the narration of. And these form the blocks and the chunks of the book of Genesis. Now, with our story here in Genesis chapter 1 with creation, what's interesting is the block or the break of this tadoleth, comes in chapter 2, verse 4. And so, as I was telling Don last week, what you need to be doing is bringing a Bible with you, because I just can't put the entire text on the screen or discuss the entire thing. But if you go to Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, you'll see that in Genesis 2, chapter 4, it says, "This is the account of the heavens and the earth." And that phrase there, "this is the account," that's the tadoleth. It says this is the narration, this is the story of, this is the history of, or this is the generations of. And that's where the break comes. And that term can refer to either what came before or what's coming in ahead of it. It's one of these transitional terms that talks about, okay, this is the story of the creation of the earth, but it's also leading us into the next act. Here's the next story that we're coming to. So these breaks help us to see when these different structures come. So in Genesis chapter 1 through 2-3, we have the first tadoleth, or the first story. And I really should have coordinated better with Don, because it's interesting, when we read the story of creation in worship, did you notice something was missing? Last day. We only read 6 of 7 days of creation. And I was kind of like, okay, there's a spot where in the 11th century, these monks that were copying our Bible, all of a sudden they said, oh, we've got this great new invention. It's kind of like iPhones, and it's called chapter breaks. And we're going to put chapters in so we can actually talk about chapter 1, chapter 2, rather than having, say, in Genesis it says this, and then you spend 10 days scrolling through the document. Oh, that's what he was talking about. So it actually goes to chapter 2, verse 3. So let's take a look at this first tadoleth, this first account of creation. Now the story opens up here with, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. You get this summary statement that's mentioned right at the very beginning. And you'll notice also that when I read chapter 2, verse 4, where you get the Todoth, it says, this is the creation of the heavens and the earth. In other words, it bookends. So this statement at the very beginning isn't a statement about creation ex nihilo or anything like that. It's an introductory summary statement telling us we're going to talk about the creation and what God did when He created. And at the very end, in 2:4, we get the summary statement again. In other words, it bookends it here for us in a literary manner. The other thing that we get as we go through this passage is it's almost poetical. When you read it in English, you kind of go, this sounds kind of really forced, and it sounds, got to make sure it's still up there. It sounds forced or it sounds repetitive with kind of some of these wooden phrases. Some of these wooden phrases that come through. But, okay, we're back. We'll look at those here in a second as to how they come through. But one of the first things we get here is in the very beginning, God created, and you have this Hebrew word bara that's used there. What's very interesting is that if you study this Hebrew word, there's only one actor that performs this verb in the Hebrew Bible, and that's God. Only God, bara, creates. And I like Don when he asked the question, how did He do it? We don't know. It doesn't tell us. And even in the Hebrew text, when you look at this word bara, one of the things that's very interesting is there's never a good definition for this term. It's just God baras. Man does other things. We make, we form, we shape, we build. But only God does this special act of bara, creation. And so when we say God created, you could also phrase it as God did it. It's one of these terms where you kind of go, okay, what are we talking about here? Well, we just don't know. We just know God did it. That's it, period. Even from the lexical meaning of the word going down here. As I was saying, the structure of Genesis chapter 1, it's kind of wooden and it repeats itself over and over again. So you get these phrases, which with each day of creation you get this phrase. God said, so He says something. Then a little bit later on it says, and it was so. And then a little bit later on you get the statement, it was good. And then at the very end you get evening and morning. And so you get this repetition going through. So it's very poetical in the way it's structured and set up. So there's a sort of a rhythm and rhyme to it. It's not complete poetry. It's not like the book of Psalms, but it's got that feel to it. So this is why when we read Genesis 1, you kind of go, this really sounds like the author's repeating himself over and over again. Well, he is, because he wants you to hear certain things. A, God said it. B, it took place. C, that it was good. And then the evening and morning moves us, transitions us into the next thing. Now, where this all breaks down is very interesting, is in day 7. That entire structure is changed in verse 7. So let's take a look at these individual days. Oops. Oh, you know what? I want to put it like this. Yeah, that's better. Instead of you seeing kind of my control panel. First off, on day 1, the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waves. Now, there's no explanation for where this chaos came from, this formless and void. It just doesn't tell us where these things came from. But for an ancient Israelite, these terms would have immediately been very, very provocative. Especially, let's say, you're off in some Akkadian village, or you're down in Egypt, or you have some Sumerian dignitary or businessman passing through, and he hears these texts mentioned. Because immediately when it says the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the face of the earth, immediately what it's doing, it's accosting or it's criticizing the various deities and gods that surrounded them in the ancient Middle East. Over the deep, oftentimes this is where the god of fertility or the mother goddess would come from. On the land, this is where the masculine deity would come from. And these two deities would then have offspring that would produce other gods, and they ruled over the waters, they ruled over the land, they ruled over the sky, they ruled over all these things. And right at the very beginning, when it addresses these things, this is not where God comes from. God is not from the deep, He is not from the void, He is not from the darkness. God takes these things and then will make the earth out of them. And so it's almost exactly the opposite of all the creation and deity stories throughout the Middle East. The other thing when he starts off here, these terms of formless and void and darkness, these really kind of appeal to or come from what we would call prototypical metaphorical categories, if you want to throw out a big term. But you know these as well. When we talk about darkness, is that a good term? No. What's in darkness? Evil, scary. You know, you go into a dark room, and what's the first thing you do? You kind of tense up a little bit and you start feeling around for a light switch. Or what? Yeah. Or my grandson, I took him under the crawl space of our house. We were working on some piping down there. And boy, he had that flashlight with him every single minute. And I made the mistake of making him the keeper of the light. So I'm trying to work on something and that light is going everywhere. But darkness is one of these categories where there's no life there. It's dark, it's evil, it's scary. The void and formless have these same things. It's kind of like you look at a huge like mud flat or something like that, and you just go, this really isn't a great place to be. It's not good. And it speaks about chaos, evil, lack of control. And what we see at the very beginning is God takes these things and He's going to form creation out of it. So I'm going to pick up this theme a little bit later on. But it starts with chaos, confusion. It doesn't specifically say evil, but it's scary. You know, this is not a good place, as opposed to like the ancient Egyptian stories where this is the primordial world where Ra and these various different gods arise from. From them, it's a good place. For the Hebrews, this is a place of nothingness. It's void, it's empty, it's dark. So God takes that in verse the first day, and into it He says, "Let there be light." So immediately, in darkness, now we have light. And what we have in the first 3 days of creation is we have sort of a forming of the formless. We're going to take and we're going to give order to chaos. And the first thing is we have light coming in. The second one is this expanse in the midst of the waters. And this is one that a lot of different people who work on ancient mythology and stuff like that, they really like to make hay out of, there's a three-tiered universe, you know, with the underworld, the world we live in, the God above, and this expanse, and we're like on the back of a giant turtle that's going through space. I mean, what they do is they're asking questions from 19th century mythology, Fraser's Great Bow, or Joseph Campbell, who's basically a 19th century mythologist, but he kind of dresses it up in 20th century garb. But they try and take those stories and read it back into the ancient world. And that's not what it's talking about. What we have here is before it was formless and void, and just as God separated light and darkness, now we have a separation of different types of waters. Waters above in the clouds, waters below. Fresh, salt water, various things like this. We see boundaries being placed. And then day 3, let there be land. Now we have a division between water and land. And then upon the vegetation. Now, as I was saying, in the ancient world, all of these things were spoken about different gods. You would have had Tama, the god of the deeps. You would have Anat, the god of the land. In the Phoenicians, as you go through the Old Testament, you'll meet the god Baal. They set up a temple to Baal, various things like this. Elijah has his battle on Mount Carmel with the prophets of Baal. Well, Baal was the god of the storm, the skies, the water above. And so you see immediately here it's saying, Baal's not a god. The clouds aren't a god. God made them. God set them apart. He put them up there. So it's this very, very strong theological argument against all the religions that surround Israel in it. But at the same time, it's not just that. You're also seeing that God is a God of order. God is also a God that brings out of chaos and darkness light and structure. And then finally, with all the different plants, God brings fertility to the land. And we'll see this again with animals, and we'll see it again with plants. Because this is one of the things that's almost found universally around the world are these fertility cults. Because, well, today we don't mind so much because we go in Walmart where all food is grown in, it's like in the back they have farms or something. You go in and you go, oh, I want some chicken. You don't actually see a chicken. You get, it wrapped in a plastic container, and we think that's what a chicken is. But for the ancient world, you would plant your crops in the spring. You would hope they grow in the summer, and in the fall you would harvest them. But what happens in the fall also? All the leaves fall, all the plants start growing. So you have these cults of fertility where, for example, I was talking about Anat, the god of the land. In the Phoenician religions, Anat would die in the fall, and that's why all things stopped living. And in the spring, Tamah, the god of the deep, would have to come and kind of make love with Anat, this dead god, to bring him back to life so that life would return to the land. And if the people weren't faithful to Ma, she wouldn't do her job so that life wouldn't come back. And you get all these cults of fertility coming along. And right here what you get is God created the world and He created it to be fertile. This isn't some fertility cult. You don't make sacrifices to things. And what's very interesting in the Old Testament is you don't give God for sacrifices for fertility. Rather, what you give is a sacrifice of first fruits. You take some of that fertility and you give it back to Him. So it's this very, very different perspective on what's taking place here. Day 5. Day 4. Let the lights be in the heavens, so you get the sun, moon, the stars. Even down today, astrology. They think the sun, the moon, the stars control our shapes. All these things. No. These aren't gods. These aren't beings. They don't have influences upon us. God put them there to shed light and also for a way for us to mark the seasons and the times of the years. Now that's setting up day 5, day 7, which we'll get to here in a moment. Day 5, let the waters swarm with living creatures. Let the earth be full of animals. Once again, this fertility and fecundity that's built into creation, and it's not something that another God gives. Rather, it says God designed the world this way. This is the way He made it. And then finally, let all the earth bring forth living creatures, and let us make humankind in our image. Now, I want to stop a minute here on day 6. Because on day 6, when man is created, this is one of these passages that gets rather interesting. First off, man is created, bara. Just like He created the light, He created the all these different things. This verb that only God does is once again applied to man. And I think what the author of Genesis is saying here is that in all these other creation myths, mankind is special in some way that they're the offsprings of gods. They are descendants from divine beings. They're the result of some divine being coming and doing something, unnatural with some part of creation. As a result, human beings start walking on the earth, and the other gods go, well, that was just plain wrong. We're going to try and kill them. And so mankind's always in this battle with good and evil along these lines. No. Right here at the very beginning, just like the previous 5 acts of bara, what God does, man is bara also. He is created. We're just like everything else. We're a creation of God in that sense. But the author of Genesis doesn't leave it there. He says that we're created in God's image. Now, one of the things that's interesting about that one is, and I'm actually going to go, there's a German theologian, Gerhard von Rad, and he's done a lot of work on the ancient world. And one of the things that he talks about that man is created in God's image is Pharaoh and the different kings and rulers and emperors of the ancient world. One of the things that they would do to let people know that this is their dominion, this is their region, is they would have statues of them carved. And then they would place these statues around the known world. And it even comes down to the 17th and 18th century, where the kings and monarchs of Europe would have portraits painted upon themselves. They would have hundreds of these things painted, and then they'd be placed in all the churches and town halls throughout their little principality, so that everybody knows, oh, we're under the rule of King Ludwig, and that's what King Ludwig looks like, and this is his dominion and his empire, that sort of thing. We kind of pick it up a little bit today, but not the same way, where we put faces on money. We don't do it with current rulers like Caesar and the different, Elizabeth and these various figures did. We do it with kind of dead rulers, which is a little interesting in its own sake. But it's still a carryover from 4,000 or 5,000 years ago in how we actually make our money today. But going back then, they would place these statues around. This is their likeness and their image to let everybody know this is their dominion and their realm. And Gerhard von Rad argues that in Genesis, when he talks about let us make man in our image and give him dominion over the earth, the verbs and language that's used here is very much like an ancient king would say, I want 100 statues made so that everybody knows this is my dominion and my control, and this is my image and likeness, so that you know that. In other words, what he's saying is that man is created to reflect God, and we're like little statues that are placed around the world to let everybody know this is God's dominion, God's control, God's region. This is his.
Does the word image translate from the original to our image? I mean, our version of what an image is?
Not quite so. It's more like a likeness type idea here. Image more conveys the idea of like a picture or a painting, and that's really going to come off the Greek with this word icon during the Greek language. With the Hebrew, it's more like likeness or representation or something like that. It's a little bit more physical, kind of like you would. Like little kids, you would take a stick and stick clay around and you go, oh, look, this is mommy. You kind of look at it and you go, as a mom, you go, oh, that is amazing, And it goes in your special moments box. But everybody else looks at it and goes, it's a stick with mud stuck on it. It's that kind of physical representation that someone else would look at and they would know that this represents something else. Let me see, what else did I have here? These ideas of to subdue and have dominion. Oftentimes when you read the commentators and stuff, we tend to read this as a result of sort of the 17th and 18th century move towards market capitals, Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, and stuff like this. And we tend to read it in this term of that we are to multiply and have control and make use of the world and subdue it and take its harvest. Now that's one possible reading, but I think within the text here we're going to see a different meaning, because Genesis 1, 2, 3, and 4 I would kind of put as another unit. So Genesis 1 through 2, 4 is the first to deal with the creation, but it's until we get through the story of Cain that there's all these themes that weave through the first 4 chapters that hook things together. And what's interesting is this verb subdue here is used a couple times in this passage and words related to it. But perhaps the best one is in Genesis 4, I think it's verse 6, where Cain is upset that God didn't like his offering. And God comes up to him and he says, Cain, sin is crouching at your door, and its desire or its inclination is to have dominion over you. Okay, so you get the dominion term there. He says, but you must subdue it. And within the context of Genesis 1, 2, 3, and 4, this idea of subdue goes back to, I think, what we see in the first day of creation, that the earth was formless and void and dark. And God subdued that, and out of it brought forth light, order, and chaos. This idea of subduing is one of resisting evil and bringing order out of chaos. It's not so much making use of the land, but it's more theologically in the context of these chapters about what's taking place, this bringing order out of chaos, resisting evil, that sort of thing. And then finally, I already talked about ancient kings and statues, so we don't have to hit that. This brings us then down to day 7, chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. Now, immediately when you read this, as you go through chapter 1, you have God said, it was so, it was good, evening and day. You've got this repetitive theme that's going through. You hit chapter 2, verse 1 with the seventh day of creation, and all of a sudden that order is completely broken. So you notice, thus the heavens and the earth were finished. All of a sudden you go, wait a second. We're talking about creation. We're in the seventh day of creation. How come everything's done? If this is talking about creation, nothing's being created anymore. What's going on? So the order is broken that way. And all the hosts of them. On the seventh day, God finished his work that he had done. He rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. Now you notice, once again, this is kind of repetitive. And they're repeating an idea because by repeating an idea, that repetition begins to draw attention to what that person is repeating. And so they repeat it so that by repeating it, you begin to notice that repetition and you begin to pay attention, why is he repeating this and being so darn redundant? Okay? And this is what's going on here. So let's take a look at structurally what's taking place here in this verse. First thing, the verb is changed from bara. Now you get this, were finished, all his work he had done, all the work he has done. In other words, it's over, it's finished, it's complete, it's done. So there's heavy emphasis on completion. Second thing is, he rested, and then God blessed, made it holy, God rested. This is where the Hebrew verb Shabbat comes in, where then you get the term Sabbath, Shabbat. Okay? And it really conveys this idea of not so much rest, but stopped. He ceased. The key thing about this is that when God rests, he blessed it. In the other religions of the ancient world, God is blessed in what he does. What's very interesting in the Hebrew notion is that the rest, the cessation from work, is where God places special emphasis on blessing. And this is a theme that will get picked up throughout the Old Testament, that God's Shabbat, his rest, isn't just the Sabbath day, but it's a state that you enter into. It's a communal way of living. It's a state of mind. It's a blessing that God gives to you, but it's also related to the seventh day. And then finally, the last thing that you see coming through here in the yellow, seventh day, seventh day, seventh day. It's kind of like he's repeating something, so by repeating it, you begin to take note. And so what happens here on this seventh day, it's setting us up for, we don't have the Sabbath yet. That's not going to come until Exodus, a whole book later on. But this idea of the seventh day comes in here. Now this is incredibly important because God blesses and makes this seventh day holy. And I was talking about the sun, moon, and stars to kind of structure morning and evening, day and night, these types of things. They set a calendar in motion that we can mark our time. And one of the things that's very interesting in the 7-day creation, it sets in motion our life as created beings within creation to follow a set sort of calendar, 7 days. And we're to enter into rest or cease from doing things on the 7th day, contrary to my wife, who always wants me to work on the house on the 7th day. Sorry. She's in the other room, just, I'll get you for this. Type thing. But God blesses and makes this 7th day holy. We see this in the account of creation. We see this that the Sabbath reminds us on a weekly basis that not only are we part of creation and that we're created by God, but we are also structured by this sort of day in, day out nature to creation that God put in place. So, summary, pulling all this together here so we don't go into the next worship service. Pulling all this together. First thing, and I didn't talk a lot about this in when we were going through for the sake of time, but for each day it is declared that it is good. That all these things are good. That there's nothing in creation that's implicitly evil, but all that God has created is good. Now what's going to happen is by the time we get to chapter 4, we're going to see that that's not so. In other words, everything's good at the beginning, but Genesis 4 is setting us up to answer the question, how come there's evil? How come there's problem? How come there's suffering? How come there are atrocities in the world? And it sets up this struggle of answering that question. How come if creation is good, do we experience these things? But we'll have to save that for another day. Second thing that this story of creation brings across is that God is sovereign. He made all things. There's not one thing that is made that has come into being that's apart from Him. God is completely sovereign over all things. So we tend to look at things and we go, what about Islam or drug trafficking or whatever problem you want to put your finger on? The whole thing is God's not surprised by these things. He's the creator of the world. He is sovereign over all things. Third thing, God by His powerful word transforms creation into a holy and blessed creation. You can't read Genesis 1 or that account of creation up to chapter 2, verse 4 without seeing this. God does it by His word, and He brings this amazing blessed creation into reality. The other thing this chapter brings across is God is before all things, made all things, and blesses all things. It's kind of the opposite or corresponds to that God is sovereign. But if God is sovereign, it means that He has done all these things. And if He's done all these things, then it means that God is completely sovereign. The other thing we see here is God's redemptive work. When we talk about God's redemption, when do you start seeing God's redemption, God's redemptive nature coming along? And all too often people point to Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, where it talks about the serpent and Eve's descendant will bruise the serpent's head. I think it goes back all the way to Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, where it talks about God bringing out of chaos, out of formless void and darkness, light, created order, and blessing. And then finally, God creates, redeems, and sanctifies. This is an incredible theme that runs through this entire chapter of God's nature and work. So, Genesis chapter 1 isn't just a story about creation or anything like this, but when you look at the chapter, it's setting us up for the entire rest of the Bible. It lays the groundwork. It lets us know who God is, what creation is, and our place within it. So I will close there today. And if you have questions or anything like that, you can join me while I'm trying to get a cup of coffee. Okay?